For those old enough to remember them, the scenes of violence in Northern Ireland have dreadful echoes of an extremely painful past.
One of the messages we've all got to be clear about with the people who are encouraging and partaking in violence is that's not what the people of Northern Ireland want to see. They want us to see Northern Ireland prosper and go forward in a positive way.
The big questions tonight: to what degree has the violence been orchestrated, and what does it mean for the future of the province? Also on News at 10. Take the jab, says the sister of the first named blood clot victim. Lessons from Chile: they vaccinated quickly but opened up too fast and are now back in severe lockdown.
To understand the knee on the neck, you need to examine your own necks.
A brutal education in breathing. More disturbing evidence in the trial of the officer accused of murdering George Floyd. I pushed the team, the texts which show Rishi Sunak's response to David Cameron on the stricken finance firm, and sent home from Australia by airmail. Surely the most bizarre story you will hear all year.
The more I look at this, the more I just find it completely unbelievable that I did it. It frightens me now.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Those involved in Northern Ireland's troubles from the 1960s to the 1990s are old men and women now. Many are grateful for the 2 decades of peace since. But faced by what they see as assaults on their community's standing, some loyalists, who of course venerate their place in the UK, have, the police say, been orchestrating the violence of recent nights, just as they did all those years ago. The police said the scenes last night of rioting and of parts of Belfast burning were the worst for years. And behind the violence on both sides of the sectarian divide were 13 and 14-year-olds, one senior officer said, cheered and clapped by adults. First Minister Arlene Foster told a specially convened session of the Northern Ireland Assembly politicians cannot allow a new generation to be preyed on by those who prefer the shadows to the light.
Fireworks and fires set in confrontation between the crowd and the police on the streets of West Belfast this evening. The trouble tonight follows unrest in the same area last night. The worst they'd seen in years, said the police, before describing perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the rioting.
What we saw was a mixture of young people and adults, but there were certainly some children present who we would assess as being as young as 13 or 14, who were encouraged and supported by adults who stood by and clapped and cheered.
The police have been very clear about the nature of the violence here in Belfast. They say it has been orchestrated and that members of paramilitary groups have been involved.
The violence unfolds amid loyalist anger about a Brexit deal which they say cuts them off from the rest of the United Kingdom.
They've left us in Europe and in the UK at the same time, and the difficulty for that for unionist people is that we've been left with no representation in Europe. We're going to be represented by a foreign power.
But the police have said this morning, pointed out how many young people are involved in this unrest, and very young people, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. What do they know really about the details of the Northern Irish Protocol?
Well, I don't think that they do, but what they do know about is people here don't have a stake in society, and they don't feel they're represented by the politicians.
Another politician arrived in Belfast today, the Northern Ireland Secretary, here for emergency talks with the main political parties.
Adults who are encouraging children to take up activity that's going to damage them for the rest of their lives in terms of their opportunities, at a time where we should be looking at investment and inward investment, an exciting time for Northern Ireland's economy and the opportunities that it has, is beyond dreadful.
The Stormont Assembly was recalled from its Easter recess this morning, and the leaders of Northern Ireland's power-sharing government were agreed on the dangers of young people being recruited into an old conflict.
We cannot allow a new generation of our young people to fall victim to that path or be preyed upon by some who prefer the shadows to the light.
It's only through democratic politics, that we can solve our problems and concerns, and call on those organising young people to engage in violence to stop, and to those young people themselves to call on them to exercise restraint.
The message from the politicians has been consistent. Dialogue is the way to settle disputes. But for all the talking that's been done today, there's no sign yet that the violence will stop. Geraint Vincent, News at 10, Belfast.
Well, our global security editor, Rohit, is also in Belfast tonight. Rohit, how organised has been the violence up to this point, and if so, by who?
Well, Tom, let's assess the scale of the violence so far. The police saying they've seen nothing like this for years. A bus hijacked, fireworks, petrol bombs, police officers injured, and as a consequence, police officers then using these scarcely used AEP weapons, these attenuating energy projectiles. The scarcity of their use perhaps an indicator of the seriousness of the situation here. But consider this too, for all the violence of the past few nights, the police are still treating this as a public order issue. They are not treating this as a terrorist issue. That perhaps gives us a glimpse behind the scenes at some of their investigation. It is not assessed at the moment that this is being planned seriously by terrorist organisations, despite the potential involvement of key paramilitary figures and despite the involvement of sectarian violence here. Important to remember that. However, what we can't say is where this goes over the next few hours, the next few days, and we can't say what impact and when it will have on the political settlement here either, Tom.
OK, Rohit, for now, thank you very much indeed. And as we saw, the Northern Ireland Assembly was recalled to Stormont to try to deal with the violence. UTV political editor Tracy McGee is there. Tracy, good evening to you. I don't know if you heard Rohit just there saying the police are treating this as a public order, not a terrorist issue at this point, which I guess is reassuring if that's the right word. But what do you make of the politics of all this?
Well, Tom, the street disorder that we saw in Belfast last night is now being discussed at the highest levels of government in London, Dublin and Washington. The Biden administration is saying tonight that it's concerned by the trouble. The Taoiseach and the Prime Minister had a conversation today by phone, both of them calling for calm. The Northern Ireland executive met today, the cross-party executive, managed to agree a joint statement calling for law and order, and as you say, MLAs at least getting a joint message out this evening from Stormont. The difficulty is that the problems here are multi-layered and complex. It's about Brexit, it's about disaffection from politics, it's about loyalist communities who feel that they have been left behind. Mainstream loyalist paramilitaries say that they are not involved in this, but clearly there are fringe elements who are involved in the orchestration. And of course, nationalist politicians say there shouldn't even be loyalist paramilitary organisations anymore. The Good Friday Agreement was signed 23 years ago this weekend. Then it was hoped that reconciliation would mean that there would be no need for peace walls. Last night it was a peace wall that protected children who weren't even born from hurting one another as they threw petrol bombs and stones at one another.
OK, it's very sad, Tracy. For now, thank you very much indeed. Now, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, said about shoring up confidence today in the AstraZeneca vaccine now that it is no longer being recommended for the under-30s. He said the chance of getting a blood clot in the brain from the vaccine was the same as from travelling on a long-haul flight. Perhaps a more moving plea for everyone to continue to trust it came from the sister of a man killed by just such a clot. Alison Assels is a pharmacist. She said, "We will save more lives overall by people having the vaccine than not."
Telford tells us something about attitudes to the AstraZeneca vaccine. People are most definitely still coming for their potentially life-saving second jabs.
I think yesterday, with all the news, we were a bit concerned. But because we've already had the first jab, I think it's better to carry on with the second one.
I'm not concerned at all because of the, the dangers of not having it are worse, aren't they?
They're coming, despite regulators confirming yesterday there's strengthening evidence the vaccine could also cause a rare blood clotting syndrome in a tiny number of recipients. Neil Assels was one of them. He died on Sunday, just over 2 weeks after receiving his AstraZeneca jab. His sister told us today his doctors were almost certain the jab caused the fatal blood clot in his brain.
I feel extraordinarily angry about the unfairness of what's happened to my brother. But at the same time, I recognise that he has been extraordinarily unlucky. It's not statistics to us, it's an actual loved human being who died. But at the same time, I still believe that for the vast majority of us, the safest way forward is for people to have the vaccine.
That kind of fortitude can only help to calm the anxiety in government that people may shun one of the only 3 vaccines we have available right now. How would you encourage them to come forward and get the jab if they're uncertain based on the evidence we saw yesterday?
Well, I'd say that the people to listen to are the world-class scientists who are working on this, and they have shown that the benefits outweigh the risks, and the benefits are there for you, but the benefits also for your loved ones, that you don't spread the disease.
Back in Telford, they feel that reassurance is the way forward.
No, I don't believe the take-up is dropping, if I'm completely honest. Usually when people have spoken to us, I'd like to believe, and judging from the responses that we've had when we've spoken to them, that we've wanted reminding them of, what the science is actually saying.
It could be more of a challenge persuading younger people to come forward who feel their risk from COVID is lower, but somehow they must if we're to put the pandemic behind us.
And Tom is, of course, here to talk about all this. Now, I gather there's been a bit of a change in the Wales roadmap. So can you talk us through the details of that and what, if anything, it means for everyone else in the UK?
Yeah, so tonight Mark Draper, the First Minister, announced because they've seen quite a significant drop in infection rates in Wales, they've decided to bring forward some of the unlocking measures that they were going to hold off into May. Some quite significant ones. So outdoor hospitality is now going to open up at the 26th of April. And by the 3rd of May, people are allowed from 2 households to meet indoors. We in England had to wait quite a little bit longer for that. May 17th, I believe, is the date for us. And I think that flexibility that Wales is showing, I think might raise questions here in the Westminster government, where, let's not forget, there are large proportions of the Conservative Party who'd like the government to move a bit quicker in terms of opening up. Yeah. Why aren't we doing the same? But I think you have to bear in mind the situation in Wales is a bit different. Cases are coming down quicker. They've got the lowest infection rates across the UK right now. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay like that. Yeah. But also, they're doing really well on vaccination. They're outstripping the rest of the UK in terms of vaccination rates because we're pausing to let second doses catch up. It's slowed down quite significantly here in England, for example. And also, infection rates are higher here in England as well. And it's not an even spread. So in parts, we've got new data out today from the REACT study. The North West, Yorkshire and Humber still have much higher rates than the rest of England. So it's not sort of a clear picture. But it certainly shows a bit of flexibility in that opening up. I'm sure that'll be welcome in Wales. But we certainly get to go back to the pub quicker because ours open up next week and Wales still have to wait for a few more weeks yet.
OK, focusing on the essentials, Tom, thank you very much indeed. It has to be. Yeah, we have to have some positive news. You're quite right. Now, in what you might call the vaccine Olympics, Israel remains way out in front at the top of the medal table, talking about positive news. But Chile is well up there as well in the chasing group ahead of the UK. 56% of Israelis have now received 2 doses and are fully vaccinated. Chile has reached more than 22% and the UK 8.4%, though. We are, as we know, doing pretty well on first jabs. With lockdown still in place in Chile last November, the total number of new confirmed infections was only 9,000 a week or thereabouts. But after relaxing lockdown, they're hitting new highs. This week saw more than 49,000 cases, the highest levels there since the start of the pandemic. So, as our own Professor Chris Whitty said, this week Chile shows that a good vaccination rate perhaps shouldn't mean the end of all restrictions straight away. Chile has had, in fact, to return to lockdown now that staff and intensive care units are once again struggling to cope.
Until recently hailed as a world beater in protecting its population from the pandemic,
Chile is suffering again. Its hospitals full of patients struggling to breathe. Almost 50,000 new COVID cases last week, the highest ever. The doctor here says the unit that looks after the most critically ill will soon run out of beds. And yet, like Britain, Chile was admired and envied for the efficiency and speed of its vaccination programme. With a third of the population inoculated, the Chilean government felt able to relax its restrictions. The now overworked medical teams at Santiago's Clínica Indisa hospital say that decision undid much of the good work.
Las señales en Chile de un mensaje de optimismo por lo rápido del proceso de vacunación puede haber influido en que la gente descuidó las medidas de protección y también se relajaron las medidas decretadas por las autoridades.
Many Chilean citizens took it as a cue to abandon social distancing. This was the march to mark International Women's Day last month. With bars and restaurants reopened and the government giving its blessing to domestic holidays, the resurgence of the virus was all too predictable, according to this nurse.
Era esperable. Uno ve en las calles como la gente se comporta como si nada pasara, como que no creyeran que esto de verdad es grave. Siguen haciendo fiestas y es triste porque hemos sacrificado los que estamos acá.
With so many new COVID deaths, this container was needed as a temporary hospital mortuary. Chile's been forced to reimpose strict lockdown. Its city streets are empty again. Businesses that had reopened now closed. In a deeply religious country, the decision to cancel normal Easter services and advise the congregation to switch to Facebook instead says much about this renewed threat. The crisis filling Santiago's cemeteries isn't exactly the same as that facing other nations. Chile has Brazil and its highly infectious variant on its border. But a senior figure in its immunization program says there are lessons for the world here.
Que no hay que perder la fe en las vacunas, va a funcionar, pero necesitamos tiempo. Y la mejor forma de ganar ese tiempo es mantener la protección.
Chile got that wrong, and a nation once praised for leading the way now has to deploy armed police to make sure its people comply with a new lockdown. Those without an acceptable reason for being out and about facing arrest. Quite a turnaround. Paul Davis, News at 10.
Let's move on now to the George Floyd murder trial in the United States, where the defence teams claim that Mr. Floyd died from a drug overdose and or a pre-existing heart condition has been roundly rubbished. A lung expert says Mr. Floyd died from low levels of oxygen. Air couldn't reach his lungs, certainly not his left one, because of the way he was being restrained on the ground. That included having a police officer's knee on his neck.
I do. The trial of fired police officer Derek Chauvin is now hearing from medical experts, including a specialist on breathing, who turned this courtroom into a classroom.
To understand the knee on the neck, you need to examine your own necks, all of you here in the jury, like I'm doing now.
4 factors, he said, led to George Floyd's death from low oxygen.
That he's turned prone on the street, that he has the handcuffs in place combined with the street, and then that he has a knee on his neck, and then that he has a knee on his back and on his side. You're able to see how they're positioned at different points.
In distressing expert evidence, he used graphics to show the position of officers and how Mr. Floyd's breathing was fatally compromised.
It was almost to the effect as if a surgeon had gone in and removed the lung. Not quite, but along those lines. So there was virtually very little opportunity for him to be able to get any air to move into the left side of his chest.
Would this be in any way akin to breathing through a small opening like a straw?
Yes, it would. So, I mean, when you have to breathe through a narrow passageway, it's like breathing through a drinking straw. But it's much worse than that, because breathing through a drinking straw, I mean, is somewhat unpleasant, but not that unpleasant. And then it gets much worse than that.
Using photographs, Dr. Tobin saw great significance in the position of Mr. Floyd's handcuffed right hand.
because he's totally dependent on getting air into the right side. So he's using his fingers and his knuckles against the street to try and crank up the right side of his chest. This is his only way to try and get air to get into the right lung.
Every time they take a fentanyl dose.
Chauvin's defence team is continuing to suggest that illicit drugs taken by Mr. Floyd were a factor in his death.
The end result of fentanyl can include respiratory depression.
Right, through the mu receptors.
Prosecutors responded that that is entirely theoretical.
Any evidence then that any fentanyl in his system depressed his breathing in any way whatsoever?
No, and that's further borne out in the carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. No further questions.
At the heart of this case is the precise cause of Mr. Floyd's death. Was it Derek Chauvin's knee on the neck or some other factor? Robert Moore, News at 10, in the United States.
We're back here now, and after a swirl of accusations about former Prime Minister David Cameron requesting government support for a finance company he was lobbying for, the Treasury has released its version of events, or a portion of it. Texted replies from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, to Mr Cameron show how persistent Mr Cameron apparently was on behalf of Greensill Capital. And Carl is here to talk us through all this. Well, what in essence have we found out tonight?
We found out a bit of Rishi Sunak's response to his old boss. Now, for anyone who hasn't been following this, Greensill Capital was a finance firm that was so close to the Cameron administration that the boss even had his own number 10 email address and business card. And when David Cameron left government, he went to work for Greensill Capital. Now, this all started because Mr Cameron was lobbying Treasury ministers, including the Chancellor, last year to try and get access to one of those emergency COVID loan firms for Greensill. Now, we know that he sent a number of texts to the Chancellor, and what the Treasury have released tonight are two of the Chancellor's replies. The first one is just a, I'm really busy at the minute, I'll talk to you later kind of a text. But the second one's a bit more illuminating. It says, hi, David, apologies for the delay. I think the proposals in the end did require a change to the market notice. Now, that's the terms of this loan scheme. That's a polite no that he's giving Mr Cameron. But, he goes on, I have pushed the team to explore an alternative with the bank that might work. No guarantees, but the bank are currently looking at it. Now, Greensill's proposal was eventually turned down. They didn't get a loan, a public loan. And a few weeks ago, the firm collapsed into administration. But what this shows, say the Labour Party, is that the Chancellor was at least considering or potentially pushing officials to alter the scheme to the advantage of Greensill. But it has to be said, none of this proves wrongdoing by anybody involved as of yet. And as far as David Cameron is concerned, he has said nothing whatsoever about any of this.
OK, Carl. Very good indeed. Thank you very much. Very clear. Now, for many celebrities and sports stars, social media has become an uncomfortable place to spend any time at all. Racist abuse makes it particularly so, of course. As we saw last night, black footballers are often on the receiving end. And today, some of their clubs ran out of patience with social media companies who are doing nothing to stop it, they say. So Rangers, Swansea City and Birmingham City are making a stand. They and their players are boycotting social media.
For months, their players have been highlighting the abuse they get online, particularly racism, but general trolling and other insults that result in no firm consequences. Now Swansea City have said enough is enough and have begun a week-long social media boycott across all club and player accounts.
If we can make a step as a club to show that, like you say, enough is enough. And really stick together and hopefully send a real powerful message to everyone in the world, not just football clubs, then I think it can only be a good thing.
Jamal Lowe, oh, he's away, chance, it's 2-0!
Last week, Jamal Lowe became the third Swansea City player to be targeted with racist abuse recently, which has prompted the club's stance. In addition to the boycott, the club has written to Twitter and Facebook, who own Instagram, urging them to instigate more stringent policing of online abuse. They're also encouraging other clubs, players and fans to follow their lead, or at least show support for what they're trying to do here. Tonight, Birmingham City and Rangers became the first to do just that. Rangers, largely in response to the online abuse suffered by Glenn Kamara, much of which came after he said he was racially abused by a Slavia Prague player.
I get abuse probably every day on my Instagram and...
Racist abuse?
Yeah, every day, easily.
Liverpool captain Jordan Henderson has taken a different approach, handing over his social media accounts to an anti-cyberbullying charity.
Liverpool! Hopefully it can help a lot of people over the next few weeks, and please, however little you may think the issue is, reach out. We can definitely help you, as I know how sometimes it can be a very dark place on social media.
Facebook told us today they share the goal of tackling abuse and holding people accountable. Football, though, seems to be saying whatever you are doing isn't working, and the game is starting to take matters into its own hands. Steve Scott, News at 10, Swansea.
Who knows what kind of summer of sport we're going to get because of virus restrictions, but today has seen something of a return to form. For a start, the Masters began in the US, and this year some spectators have been allowed back onto the course. Among the early leaders is England's Justin Rose. Tiger Woods was, of course, absent, still recovering from his February car crash. Back here and to another Tiger as the Grand National Festival at Aintree got under starters' orders. Tiger Roll, who won the National in 2018 and 19, finished fourth in today's big race. And it was also the opening day of the county championship cricket season. This was a rather chilly Lords where Middlesex made a solid start against Somerset. Finally, way back in 1965, a young Welshman in Australia was feeling homesick but didn't have the money for the airfare home. He did some thinking outside the box and hit on the idea of sealing himself up inside one and flying back as freight. He thought he'd nailed it. He did, though, need two friends to nail down the crate. It turned into a pretty hair-raising journey. Well, now Brian Robson is a rather more sensible 76-year-old and wants to reconnect with those friends who helped him with his crate escape.
We're in the prison ward of Los Angeles General Hospital, where Brian Robson, formerly of Australia, has made an unexpected visit.
His tale was as astonishing then as it is today. The Welshman and his belongings, who flew halfway around the world, stuffed into a cargo crate.
Of course, we had just enough room for a suitcase, myself to sit with my legs up in the air, my back against one wall sort of thing.
Brian Robson was 19 at the time.
The more I look at this, the more I just find it completely unbelievable that I did it. It frightens me now.
He'd been working in Australia but couldn't afford to fly home, so asked his mates to put him in a box and post him.
Early in the morning, I got in there, wriggled around a bit, put my knees up into my chest. Then, after saying goodbyes, they nailed the lid on and the truck came and picked it up and took me to the airport.
What was it like inside?
Frightening, terrible. Although the crate had "this side up" written on it, it was immediately turned upside down, as most airport workers do. And so I was standing on my neck and my head for probably up to 23 hours, actually.
In the end, he spent 5 days inside, barely alive by the time he got out. And he didn't even make it home. The crate ended up in Los Angeles, where an airport worker discovered it before climbing inside himself to demonstrate Brian's ordeal.
Your breathing became very sort of restricted, and it was cold, really cold.
Did you regret it?
I never regretted it.
Even when you were in there?
Even when I was in there. I made my mind up, and I was suffering. I really was suffering in bad ways.
Once the Americans were convinced he wasn't a Cold War spy, Brian finally returned to Britain. But despite huge media attention, he never again made contact with the two Irish friends who'd helped him begin his voyage. Half a century on, he wants to track them down.
I'm not the most generous of people, but I'd buy them all the beers they want. It would be quite amazing, actually.
It would mean a lot.
It would.
He's finally written a book about his adventure. Finding the people who sent him home all those years ago would be the perfect end to a remarkable journey. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Cardiff.
If you're out there, guys, get in touch. What an absolutely priceless story. Good night. Thanks for watching.